One of the hardest things about teaching is, and the zany professor taught me about this, is that you have to be able sometimes to take the complex and make it simple, just for the purposes of teaching. And other time, and what the difficulty of that sometimes is when you go into the complexity, you have to get very technical so that even though the person that doesn't quite understand yet can hear the technicalities, because the process of learning is not about hearing then understanding. The process sometimes of learning is hearing, being confused, thinking through it. The process can take so long you don't even realize you're learning. Philosophy was like this for me. I spent a lot of time not really fully understanding and yet continuing to study, to the point where you finally do fully understand things you at first didn't even have a dream of. So what I would urge, I hope here, is a little bit of patience and effort to understand. That is required for some of this. For anyone who wants to conform their mind to God's ways, you're going to have to get used to that process. The other part that makes this so difficult is, in order to simplify it, I have to understand it myself. And I'm not giving myself infinite amount of time to come here and make a video on this. I'm giving myself a week. So I'm going to do the best I can. And I apologize if you come across something that shows that this is not completely accurate. I'm doing the absolute best I possibly can. So in the second half of the debate, this is where it really becomes a debate. And through my studies, I found out that there are some people out there that have been waiting a long time for this face-off. They had been wanting Penrose to come out there and smash Craig over the head with some of his statements, particularly about how Craig had in the past used some of Penrose's and Hawking's models to demonstrate that his elements of his Kalam cosmological argument were what they would call prove the existence of God, which is not what Craig said. He's responsible about these things. He said implied it, or in so many words. But I guess maybe that's possible. I misunderstood the opponents here too, so I should say that. But so I have some things that are going to sound complicated. You may not understand them at first, but then just with a little bit of thought, it may not take long. Hopefully I've made it simple enough that it won't be a difficult process. Okay, so I have to go through my zany notes with all of its zany misspellings and see what happens. So I apologize if they sound a little off. Okay, first part is this. Craig, in defense of the second premise of Kalam, sees temporal relativism as ensconced only by measurements of time, not part of the actual nature of time. He holds to a Newtonian universal clock. He calls himself a Lorentzian in this respect. So the second premise is typically attacked. So what does that mean? Okay, so in his argument for Kalam, the first premise is this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The second premise is the universe began to exist, and then the final premise is the universe began to exist, therefore it was caused. And of course, it's the second premise that is commonly attacked. And of course, that's where a lot of their debate over this issue comes in. And what Craig was arguing for was a Newtonian notion of temporal mechanics that just says that although our instrumentations seem to confirm a form of relativism, Craig is saying that, in fact, it's the measurement that's relative and not the actual time itself. Now, Penrose goes in and says, look, if you look at the Andromeda Galaxy, if I go a little bit more forward, I'll see things differently than if I go backward. The order and all that will appear to me differently. And that's fine, but I don't think it gets to the heart of what Craig is saying in terms of measurement. Okay, he's saying that it's our measurements that are affected by the constants we see. All right. So that's significant. Now, I will just tell you, there's no solid conclusions on some of this. You don't walk away from this going, okay, so it's clearly measurement. No, but it is worth your time to consider. In the past, I've been told that temporal relativism has been confirmed because we have had clocks that were sent up in space or whatever the case, and when we get them back, they're off because of the speed that they go. And what Craig is saying, no, that confirms that the measurement is relative. I think a reasonable objection. Is there a conclusion here? No, not in my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. I didn't see any reason to conclude that either of them had proven the case. It's just not enough time to do that. My gut tells me Craig's right. I've already admitted I'm kind of biased here, but that is my gut. I feel that there is a temporal constant in the universe. But that said, that also leads to some things about God theologically that I'm not sure I entirely agree with. As Craig said, that God did not exist within time until he created time. Then God both existed in time and doesn't exist in time. That seems awfully convenient theologically. I'm not sure I agree with that, and I haven't done enough study on that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. All right, let's talk about CCC. What is it? It's called conformal cyclical cosmology. Conformal comes from conformal geometry. Now, what is that? Well, basically, it is that you can have an object, let's say a triangle, that in order to be a triangle, its dimensions have to be constant, but the size of the triangle can change. So if it can be a longer triangle or smaller or a larger, right? But there has to be a sense of conformity in order for it to retain the shape triangle, okay? And then cyclical. That should sound familiar to anyone who knows anything about multiverse theory and so forth. And even though Penrose, want to be clear about this, rejects the multiverse, Craig's basically says in so many words that the net effect is that it's a multiverse. And I agree with Craig on this wholeheartedly. I don't see what the difference is. Essentially, it just says you have what Penrose calls eons, okay? And so there is a Big Bang event, and you have a low entropy state. I'm going to explain it. A low entropy state at the beginning, and then a high entropy state. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you're observing the universe right now, as I said earlier in my previous video, there's this background noise, and it appears to be coming from all different sides. And so they said, oh, this must mean that when we trace this back to the Big Bang, it will all be high entropy. What does that mean? It basically means this, that there's a sense of disorder and randomness. The universe is moving more and more towards disorder and randomness. And they said when you go back to the beginning, it appeared that would continue to be the case. And that's not the case. When you get closer to the beginning, you get to what you would call low entropy yield. What is that? It just basically means there's a lot of order. Highly ordered. And they found that it would have to be that way for our universe to even exist. For us to have matter or some of the constants we notice, you would have to have a highly ordered beginning. What's that sound like? Well, it's called fine-tuning. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with fine-tuning because there's so much information out there. But if you're interested in that, you should look it up. Now, my favorite part of the debate is when they put a chart up. And I'm going to give you, I'm going to show you how this went. So here, let's see, can you see that better this way? Yeah, see, so what you had is you had Penrose going, see, it goes like this, and he would go, and then Craig slapped his hand away, and he went, no, it goes, and he was like, no, and it was rather confusing. That was my least favorite part of the debate. Actually, this is, though, in all seriousness, if you look, it is a model for the, would you quit moving, please? Thank you. It is the CCC model, kind of supposed to help you understand it a little bit more. It didn't help me. I thought the words were more helpful, but I thought maybe if you got a chance to see that, it might help you. And you, if you type in conformal cyclical model, that'll come up. It'll be one of the first things you see. So each capitulation, that is, each new, when there's a new Big Bang, okay, each capitulation is called an eon, and the later conditions of each eon features collisions of great black holes. So, for example, that might be the Milky Way and the Andromeda Galaxy's inevitable clash. All right. Now, Penrose believes each subsequent eon is capable of detecting these collisions from the previous eon. So, to prove his statements, what he's saying is this: we in this eon ought to be able to detect collisions of black holes from the previous eon. That's fascinating. It was really, really profound and very interesting. Penrose claims that these have been observed by Polish cosmologists. This was a few years ago, within that year. And Craig's response says this. It's kind of interesting. He says, well, that data is undeterminative. Most cosmologists explain the data in an alternative way, and Penrose enthusiastically agreed with this. I thought that was very interesting. And then Craig pointed out that photons don't disappear, and Penrose agreed with that. But really, what Craig said was, you believe that photons disappear, and Penrose said, no, I don't believe that. But then he failed to explain. Now, it wasn't all Penrose's fault that he failed to explain. I think it was time to kind of move the debate on. And that's part of what makes Justin Bradley so good, is he knows when to do that. But in this particular case, it was like, oh, let the guy answer this. I remember being like, I really want to hear him answer this. There were several times where both Craig and Penrose probably could have elaborated and been very fruitful, but it would have been something that would have been a drag for most people. Now, the metric of time. If signals are understood correctly, it would only prove 2 eons. And that's what Craig is saying. Look, these observable signals, these crashing black holes from the previous eon, it would prove our eon and that eon. It would not prove infinite eons. But I do think that the insinuation is these infinite eons. And causation is not temporal in this case, because the events would not exist in time, but rather before and after events. Think about it this way, okay? It would be like this. So when we measure time here in our universe, what Penrose is trying to say is these previous eons can't be measured that way. I think that's what he's trying to say. And essentially, although they are metrically prior to this eon, that doesn't make them temporally properly prior. And Craig agreed with that. And I agree with that. I think that makes sense. You don't want to apply our universal understanding of time to something that would be outside of it, whether we believe it or not. I don't believe it, but I'm saying that it logically doesn't make sense. So he's saying you can have a before without a temporal before. And that does make sense. And not just because Craig said so. If you really think about it, it does, at least by my understanding. Now, Penrose, this bugs me. I didn't like this at all. He went to the Vatican. He explained this model. And just because you don't understand something doesn't mean you have to agree. I don't, okay, you don't fully understand something. At some point, you have to kind of ask, well, it's going to require further study. And he said, they concluded, well, God made the whole lot. Infinitely? Okay. And Craig pointed out that this was actually older cosmological understandings had no problem with that, saying God created that structure, even though there wasn't the CCC at that time. It's because it's the same implication. Now, I think Craig at the very end of this debate really ends up doing a good job showing why there's problems here. But I'll just say, for my money, we're going to get into the areas where I have some issues. So let me get into that. But I'll just say, for my money, I'm not going to say, well, God created the whole lot. I want to understand how this affects our understanding of God now, given that we feel that this is the only universe he's made. That's not to say he hasn't made other things or other universes. It's quite possible. I'm not the final authority on that, right? I'm just saying that that's the way I'm going to understand it for now. Okay. So, fine tuning. Penrose sees a low entropy state at the beginning, which is essential for our universe to exist as it rapidly moves into a high entropy state. And that is to say, an ordered state to an increasingly disordered state. And what this is called, back in maybe the early 2000s, we called this inflation. And it just means that the early state of the universe was highly ordered, and then in a very rapid state moved into disorder. And then we end up with the constant values we have now. Think about that. Utterly fascinating. Again, I agree with Paul. You look at the created order, it's not a big leap to look beyond it. It's really not. And I think this just proves it even more, in my opinion. And again, Penrose is very skeptical. He says he's agnostic in this area. And Craig calls him on it. Craig points out that this universe is highly improbable given the CCC model. And Penrose says it's an answer. I wish Craig had said, is that answer hopeful? Because when Craig gave an answer as to how to unify the three distinctive mysteries that I mentioned in the last video, Craig said, it's an answer. And he said, I'm just not sure it's helpful. Well, he kept saying, I don't like it. I don't like this answer. That's what Penrose kept saying. I don't like it. I don't like it. Why don't you like it? Because it's not helpful? Or if it is helpful, how's it helpful? So you can deny the fine tuning? And he does have a problem with fine tuning. He said that. So here's my take, which Penrose addresses at the very, very end. What Penrose says, what I say is this. You have these eons, right? Or what I call recapitulations. So you have an eon, all right, a black hole event, a new eon, a black hole event. Now, when you go down the line here, you have an eon, a black hole event, an eon. And then to this next step, he would say you have a slight variation, an evolutionary step. To the next step, a slight variation, an evolutionary step. All right. Now, he said maybe at one of these, the conditions we need for our universe is there. That makes no sense given what we know about evolution. You're applying evolutionary logic to these eons, right? Which makes way more sense than a multiverse, in my opinion, because we can use the logic of this universe to understand the logic of a different eon. That makes sense. The idea that we use the logic of this universe to understand the illogic of another one doesn't. So I can see why this model is attractive. However, why would we expect the evolutionary process to leap? That's not something I think one would expect to see. Now, he says the math bears that out. There was no time to address that. I got to know how the math can bear that out. If the math does bear it out, you have to admit it because the math is never wrong on these things. Now, you may be misunderstanding me here and thinking that I'm saying the math is never wrong. We've explained away God. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, though, the math is meant to be predictive. And you don't come to conclusions until you show that it is predictive. And the CCC is predictive in some ways, apparently. In ways that I understand? No, because I don't know the math. Okay? But I do know that from what I'm seeing here, the idea, and Craig says this, we don't need a model this complex. We don't need an eon this complicated to have an observable universe. We could have one much, much simpler. Now, I may restate that when I read this, so I apologize if I do. Now, Penrose says 1 of every 5 million or so has the correct conditions along the lines of the formal structure, which in my opinion doesn't make sense. But later Penrose addresses this and says that continuity is not always necessary according to the numbers, but fails to explain how that is. And I just think it was a matter of time. Craig points out that our current level of complexity is unnecessary and inadequate, by the way. And I didn't have enough time. This is where I ran out of time. I wanted to really press in on why he said it was inadequate. That's strong language. Inadequate to explain how much more simplistic it could be. He was forceful on this. He said it is inadequate to explain. And I don't think Penrose got an opportunity to really explain. So I don't want to make it sound like Craig slam dunked him here and Penrose got no chance to, didn't have a good response. That's not really what happened. There's just limited time for a really big subject. Man, I'll tell you something. This was a really good debate. It was so fascinating, especially after doing the research. When I realized how many people were itching for Penrose to come in here and just stick it to Craig. And that's not what happened. Craig did a good job, as he always does. One last note I want to say. I've argued for Christians to argue from the periphery. That is to say, look, there's this veil that we can't seem to penetrate. That's what this model is attempting to do, by the way. It's attempting to say we can observe the crashing black holes, what they call the signals, from a previous eon, and that pierces the veil. And then we can reintroduce the other mystery as well. You can't have actual infinites, so what's going on? There has to be initial conditions and so forth. Okay. That's all debatable issues you can get into another time. And by the way, the model, if you're interested, it's Leibniz that said he had no issue with there being an infinite series of universes, and yet you could have a creator that creates the whole bunch, so to speak. I don't think we even need to go there personally, but whatever the case. I may revisit this, but I will say this. Arguing from the periphery. Craig catches some heat, I think, from some Christians for arguing evidentially. I agree with some of that criticism, particularly what James White has to say about it. And here's why. Because I think that Craig is really good at beating them at their own game, playing within their rules. And that's highly entertaining. It's very entertaining. Do I think that that's the best way to go about it? No. I actually like the idea of undercutting defeaters, right? Presenting undercutting defeaters that show that they've built the edifice and their argument on shifting sand. And then offering, and this is where White, I think, would disagree with me, and then offering rebutting defeaters. That is to say, some evidence that operate within their rules, just to say, even within your rules, there's some evidence that you don't fully have this now. And that Craig demonstrates we can do, for sure. Should you be intimidated by CCC? No, you should be intimidated by the math. I don't think any of us are going to be doing the math anytime soon. The zany professor claims he can do the math. I mean, that guy's never wrong, man. So, anyway, fascinating. You should watch this, and you should type in keywords you don't understand into Google. So good. So good.